Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're looking at how social media affects teenagers. We've got tons of research studies, expert opinions, and even surveys from teenagers themselves. And it's interesting stuff, not just the simple good versus bad you usually hear.
Yeah, the conversation around teenagers and social media can be pretty negative. But if we only look at the downsides, we miss half the story. So we're going to look at both sides, the good and the bad. And most importantly, we'll see what the newest research says. Because there are a lot of assumptions that just aren't true.
Okay, so let's jump right in. 31% of teenagers in the US say that social media is mostly a positive thing in their lives. Why is that? What are teens saying about why they feel this way?
Well, it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it from their point of view. Social media is how they talk to their friends, keep up with everything, and find new things they might never have found before. The surveys show that teenagers really value social media to get information, explore their interests, and find other people who are interested in the same stuff. It's about finding communities and feeling like you belong, even if it's online.
Okay, so it's not just posting selfies and scrolling forever. They're actually using it to learn and grow in some ways. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. And that leads into some of the research showing that social media helps with creativity and self expression. Look at TikTok, for example. Teenagers are using it for music, art, comedy, you name it. They're developing new skills and finding their voices in ways we never could have imagined.
It's funny how things come full circle. Like when MTV first came out, adults were losing it, convinced it would turn our brains to mush. But look at us. We survived.
That's a great point. It shows that adults have always been afraid of new kinds of media. We saw it with novels, rock music, video games, and now social media. But technology itself isn't good or bad. It's all about how it's used. And for a lot of teenagers, social media lets them explore who they are, get more confidence, and even practice social skills that they can use in real life.
So even for shy teenagers who maybe don't like talking to people face to face, social media can actually be a good thing.
Totally. For some teens, talking to people online feels safer. It gives them a place to express themselves and practice being social. It can help them be more confident in real life.
That's really interesting. Okay, so we've talked about some of the good stuff, but let's be honest. There are also real concerns about how social media affects teenagers.
Oh, of course. And
Yeah.
one of the biggest concerns, and a lot of research backs this up, is that it can be bad for body image, especially for girls. Think about it. They're constantly seeing these perfect edited pictures. It's so easy to compare yourself to that, start doubting yourself, and sometimes even develop eating disorders.
It's like everyone's always trying to show this perfect filtered version of themselves. And it sets impossible standards.
Exactly. And it's not just looks either. There's the whole issue of social comparison in general. Seeing everyone else's seemingly perfect lives all the time, their vacations, their achievements, their relationships, it makes people feel inadequate and less happy with their own lives.
Yeah, I get that. You're just hit with everyone's highlight reel all the time. And it's easy to forget that everyone struggles sometimes.
And here's where things get even more interesting. Those concerns are real, but the research on the direct link between using social media and mental health issues like anxiety and depression is more mixed than you might think.
Really, I always thought it was basically a given that more screen time equals more problems. What does the research actually say?
Some older studies did show a correlation, but the newer research, especially the really good studies that control for other things, don't find such a clear connection. For example, one big study followed over 500 teenagers for 8 years. And they found that using social media wasn't directly linked to having anxiety or depression.
Wow, that's a big deal. So are we saying that the media is making too big of a deal out of this?
Not exactly, it's just more complicated than that. What researchers are starting to realize is that it might not be about how much time teenagers spend on social media. It might be about how they're actually using it.
Okay, I'm listening. What do you mean by how they're using it?
There's a big difference between actively using social media and passively using it. Active use is when you're really engaging and interacting, like talking to people you care about, sharing your thoughts and ideas. Passive use is more like just mindlessly scrolling, just taking in content without really interacting, not giving anything back. And the research suggests that passive use is what's linked to bad outcomes.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between having a good conversation with friends and just zoning out in front of the TV for hours.
Exactly. And this difference between active and passive use is super important because it shows that social media itself might not be the problem. It's how it's being used.
So it's not about saying social media is evil. It's about helping teenagers use it in a healthier, more balanced way, which, to be honest, is probably good advice for all of us.
You got it. And to add another layer of complexity, researchers are also looking into the idea that using social media too much might actually be a symptom of other problems, not the cause. Like a teenager who has social anxiety or feels lonely might escape into the online world as a way to cope. So their increased screen time is a reflection of those deeper problems.
It's hard to say which came first, the social media use or the other problems.
Exactly. And that's why we can't oversimplify things. We have to look at the whole picture. The relationship between social media and how teenagers are doing is complicated, to say the least. Right before the break, we were saying that sometimes when a teenager uses social media a lot, it's not the main problem. It could be a sign of other issues. Like if they're struggling with things like anxiety or loneliness, they might use the online world to feel better. And that can lead to even more screen time, so it becomes this kind of vicious cycle.
It's almost like using social media as a way to cope, like self-medication.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it shows how important it is to deal with those underlying issues, instead of just focusing on getting them to spend less time on their screens.
Okay, so given all this,
Yeah,
what advice would you give to parents and educators who are worried about the downsides of social media? Where should they even start?
I think we need to move away from this idea of fear and just telling them not to do things, and instead try to understand and guide them. So instead of just saying, put your phone down, we should talk to them openly and honestly about how they're using social media, what they get out of it, and what risks to be aware of.
So it's about helping them be more thoughtful and intentional about how they use social media.
Exactly. We need to help them learn how to think critically so they can use the online world safely and responsibly. Teach them how to spot fake or unrealistic stuff, how to be careful about the information they're seeing, and how to prioritize real life relationships.
And maybe encourage them to use social media in different ways, like focusing on actually engaging with people instead of just passively scrolling through their feeds.
Absolutely. Help them explore those creative options, find communities that share their interests, use social media as a tool for learning and growth, not just for entertainment or validation.
You mentioned before that some of the first studies on social media and mental health weren't perfect. Can you say more about that? What were the problems with those studies?
Yeah, a lot of those early studies relied on people reporting on themselves, which can be unreliable and biased. And they also didn't always consider other factors that could affect mental health, things like family issues, school stress, or pre-existing conditions.
So it was hard to say for sure that social media was the cause of the problem.
Right. And that's why newer research has focused on more objective measures, like tracking actual screen time or using physical signs of stress and anxiety. And those studies show a more complex picture. They suggest that the relationship between social media and well-being isn't so simple.
It sounds like there's still a lot we don't know. What kind of research do we need going forward to really figure out how social media affects teenagers? What are the big questions we still need to answer?
Well, one thing we need is more long-term studies. Studies that follow teenagers over a long period to see how their social media use changes and how that's connected to their mental health and overall well-being. We also need to get better at distinguishing between different types of social media use. Is it active or passive? What platforms are they using? How are they interacting with others? All these things could have different effects.
So it doesn't make sense to lump all social media use together. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the differences between individual teenagers. What might be good for one teen could be bad for another. It depends on their personality, their support systems, and their overall mental health.
So we really need to take a more individualized approach. There's no easy answer or solution that works for everyone.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that social media is always changing. New platforms pop up, trends change, and teenagers are constantly using these technologies in new ways. So the research needs to keep up with those changes to give us accurate and relevant information.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
You could say that. But that's part of what makes this feel so interesting. It's a constant challenge to think critically and update our understanding as we learn new things.
So where does all this leave us? We've talked about the good, the bad, and the really complicated. What's the main takeaway for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this information about teens and social media?
I think the main takeaway is that the relationship between social media and how teenagers are doing is a nuanced one. It's not as simple as saying social media is good or bad. It depends on how they're using it, the individual teenager, and the context.
So it's not about saying technology is evil. It's about using it wisely and thoughtfully, and having those open conversations with the teens in our lives.
Exactly. And we need to remember that this isn't just a problem for teenagers to solve on their own. Adults need to step up and help young people navigate this complex digital world.
We need to be mentors and guides, not just rule enforcers.
I love that. And that means being open to learning from teenagers themselves, listening to their experiences, and working together to figure out what works best.
This has been such a helpful conversation, and it's been a real learning experience for sure. We started off by debunking the idea that all teens think social media is bad. Remember that surprising 31% who actually see it as a positive thing. Then we dug into the research and found out that the effects of social media on mental health are way more complicated than people make it out to be.
Yeah, it's not just about banning social media or setting strict screen time limits. It's about understanding the complexities, respecting individual differences, and ultimately encouraging healthy and balanced use.
Right. We need to give teenagers the skills to be critical thinkers and navigate the digital world safely. And maybe they can even use the power of social media for good.
I like that way of looking at it, and it's important to remember that even us adults are still figuring out this whole digital world thing. We might not have grown up with smartphones glued to our hands, but we're all learning and adapting as we go.
Definitely. It's something we're all figuring out together. Which brings me to something we talked about earlier, this idea of media panics. It seems like every new type of media, from books to rock music to video games, has been met with fear and suspicion from older generations. Do you think social media is just the latest example of this?
There's definitely a pattern there. Throughout history, adults have always been wary of new forms of media. They worry that it'll corrupt young minds and mess up traditional values. But here's the thing, those fears almost never come true.
Yeah, like the whole freak out over comic books in the 50s,
Oh.
or the hysteria over rock music in the 60s. Looking back, it seems kind of ridiculous, right?
That it really does, and it reminds us to be careful about jumping to conclusions and assuming the worst about new technologies. Of course, we should be aware of potential risks and guide young people accordingly, but we also need to be open to the possibilities and avoid just repeating the mistakes of previous generations.
It's about finding that sweet spot between caution and curiosity. We don't want to stifle innovation or shut down opportunities for connection and creativity, but we also want to ensure teenagers are using technology safely and responsibly. It's a tricky balance to strike.
It is, and that's where open communication and learning from each other come in. We need to create spaces where teenagers feel comfortable talking to adults about what they experience online without being judged or having adults overreact.
So instead of lecturing them or setting strict rules, we should have honest conversations and work together to find solutions.
Exactly. It's about empowering them to take charge of their digital life instead of just following rules and restrictions.
And maybe, just maybe, we can learn a thing or two from them in the process. I know I've definitely learned more about social media from talking to my teenage nieces and nephews.
I know what you mean. Teenagers are often at the forefront of digital trends, so they can give us valuable insights into how these platforms are used and how they affect their lives.
It's like they're fluent in this digital language,
Yeah,
and we're still trying to figure out the basics.
that's such a great way to put it. And just like learning any language, it takes time, patience, and a willingness to make mistakes.
So as we wrap up, what's the most important message you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that it's complicated. There are no easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions. But if we come at this with an open mind, a willingness to learn, and a commitment to open communication, we can help teenagers use the digital world safely and responsibly, and maybe even discover some amazing things along the way.
We hope this has given you some fresh perspectives, some things to think about, and maybe even a bit of hope. And hey, if you're looking for a fun throwback, give Kids in America by Kim Wilde a listen. It's a fun reminder of how adults have always worried about new trends. Until next time, keep learning, keep connecting, and keep those conversations going.